So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this important conversation for the High Holy Day season. It's part of the series of our Days of Awe programming that bring real life and contemporary circumstances to our observance of the High Holy Days. Tonight, it is my distinct honor to have with me Darwin Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton is best known as the co-chair of Grassroots Leadership in our community, and that organization focuses on issues surrounding for-profit prisons, appropriate legal representation for the indigent, and reentry of those who are former felons into society. He was also a member of the Oversight Board for the new Public Defender's Office, and also is part of Just Leadership USA, and is a member of Austin's Essential Class of 2018. To frame this discussion tonight a little bit, this is a time period for the Jewish community of teshuvah, of repentance and turning, more importantly, turning towards a better direction in life. And there is no greater example of this than the life of Darwin Hamilton. This is a man who has spent some time in prison, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but more importantly, has taken that time and as well as other factors in his life, and made his life into a model of what it means to be not just a good citizen, but also a community leader and advocate. And so it's with great joy and appreciation that I'm going to engage in some conversation with Darwin. And we're just going to talk back and forth. And those of you who are watching this, just go ahead and listen and enjoy. Darwin, you're a fifth generation Austinite. And you're descendant of slaves, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. I recently found this out about 15 years ago when the city of Austin was seeking to acquire heir property and property that my father left and my great-grandparents left on East 11th Street, which now is the African American Cultural Center and the site of the Black Chamber of Commerce. And so my ancestral home is still there. It's a little yellow house called the Dietrich Hamilton House, which was named after my second great-grandfather, Thomas Jedrick, who was a slave during emancipation, or after, I would say, Reconstruction, built that house in the 1870s. And what is significant about it is because it remained in the same family 4 or 5 generations down to me before the city of Austin acquired it through eminent domain. And what is significant about that is because it is the oldest house in East Austin before the Koch and Fowler plan that codified Jim Crow segregation in Austin in 1928, which is called the 1928 Master Plan that segregated African Americans east of I-35. And so it's the oldest house in the neighborhood. And, you know, as African Americans, often we can't point to a place and say that this is the origin of our family post-slavery or prior. So that's what makes it significant.
That is really significant. Let's not leave that eminent domain case too quickly. You, yes. In fact, did you represent your family in regard to that? In regard to that case?
Yes, I did. That was around 2002, 2003. And so it's like a David versus a Goliath in of resources, because the cost to go to jury trial on an eminent domain case is about $15,000. Counter appraisals are like $3,000 when the city makes an offer to you. In the case, it's, you know, generally a lowball appraisal. And so in order to challenge that, you have to go hire an appraiser, spend $3,000. Well, I didn't have those kind of resources at the time, so my best resource was me. And so I began researching eminent domain cases, researching about different appraisal approaches, and said, well, I'm going to go in here and represent myself and family because I don't believe anyone else is a better voice or an advocate than me personally.
And you were quite successful in that process. You handled that situation well to the advantage of your family, and that is wonderful. That is great. So this raises an issue that I'd like to explore with you a little bit before we get into your life story. And here it is. One of the things I find remarkable about your life story is that while you realize, and in a sense, you were victimized by the system, nonetheless, you have the trail of your life is trying to reform the system and not withdraw from it. I mean, I'm thinking about the nature of the work that you do outside of your everyday work, outside of your day job, which we'll get to as well, of advocacy within the community. I'm thinking about the fact that you didn't just complain about the system in terms of eminent domain. You went out and figured out how you could affect the system in terms of eminent domain, and were effective doing that. Can you talk about that basic outlook on life that says that I don't want to blow up the system, I want to make the system actually work and be part of it in that way?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say blow up the system because, there probably was a time in my life where I did want to blow up the system because I was, angry, of course, and very hurt and wounded along the way. But that's also something that I use that anger as fuel to motivate me. So that's the impetus of me wanting to, fight or combat and dismantle systems in a way to where they would work. So that's just kind of something I think that is more innate about me, is that desire to never give up. I mean, of course, there are times where wisdom, calls us to concede. And so I listen to that voice. I reflect often. But yet it was just more of a personal trait of mine to where, if something's not going well or if something's not working and I have the wherewithal to find the resources to do something about it, then that's what I'm generally going to do.
It is an admirable and in some ways remarkable attitude, and that's really great. Okay, so let's get into your life story a little bit. So we talked for a couple minutes lightly about where you grew up, but really didn't talk in any detail about that. Those of us like myself who are relatively new to Austin. My wife and I have been here about 18 years or so. Have watched the East Side change tremendously. It's not the same place as where you grew up. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about what it was like growing up on the East Side of Austin.
Certainly. Well, I am a child of the 70s, so I grew up during the 70s soul music era, Black exploitation films like Superfly, Car Wash, those kinds of films. And the area, prior was once a thriving community because it was segregated and it had to be. So 11th Street, I would say, was the main thoroughfare that you could say was comparable to 125th in Harlem, where you had vibrant, businesses, nightclubs, restaurants, and those kind of things. And as with most inner cities, there are pockets of crime. And so 11th Street became known for pimping, prostitution, because of the subculture of that nightlife. And so this was the world outside of my window as a child, even though my parents were a working class family. My father was an educator who taught industrial arts, and my mother did administrative work in hospitals. And the reason that we lived there was because my father bought the adjacent lot to the historic home that I recently talked about. So this was the homestead in that environment growing up in the 70s. And around the 80s and 90s, of course, is when the crack epidemic came all across the country. And I was about 15, 16 years old at the time, and lured by that lifestyle because my older brother was someone that I was seeking validation from. He was 5 years older than me and had become involved in the life of, pimping and prostitution. And being this young kid, always wanting to, follow my brother, and he wouldn't let me go with him until I became of age, so to speak, around 16 or 17. And we ultimately became crime partners, if you will, like Frank and Jesse James in a sense. We just weren't outlaws in the sense that we were going and robbing banks. But that's generally what happened in my case. Was going to high school. So it was like I was living a duality of life, going to school by day and then committing crimes or petty crimes at night after school.
And in fact, you finished LBJ High School, right?
I actually did. And I didn't struggle through high school. I mean, I was one of those bright students who could put forth minimal effort and still be successful. I can honestly say I didn't really do a lot of homework or studying until it was test or quiz time, and I would prevail. So that's who I am in a sense.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that concept. So you got yourself in some trouble. My understanding is you were caught with just enough cocaine to be potentially distributing it, and that was the charges that were brought against you.
Yes.
Still, from the description I saw in the book, at least a relatively small amount. But nonetheless, you were arrested. And initially, you decided not to take a plea bargain, is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Why did you make that decision? I'm curious.
Well, here's what happened. It was September the 1st of 1992. So I'm approaching a 28-year anniversary here. I was recently graduated high school, hadn't been out of school more than 3 months. And there was a drug raid that happened based on a tip of an anonymous confidential informant. And so after being arrested and in spending time in the county jail for a couple of weeks, a gentleman that I knew from the community was also incarcerated, and he set some legal research outside my cell. And I started reading about the case laws around possession, controlled substance, search and seizure. And so I started studying the law while I was incarcerated and requesting affidavits for the search warning, getting copies, and decided, well, we're going to go to pretrial. And when we went to pretrial, in the discovery, we asked questions about, was there a surveillance? The police said yes. Was there footage of the control buy, which is me and the informant who I supposedly sold drugs to?
Right.
And there wasn't. Was there any marked or recorded money during the commission of this control buy? And there wasn't. And then through my research, I would discover that, the state and federal constitution and code of criminal procedure requires that a probable cause affidavit demonstrating probable cause must be filed before a search warrant can be issued. And my father was alive at the time, and he went to obtain copies, and there was none on record. And so I would argue back and forth with my court-appointed attorney at the time, well, based on these technicalities, this charge should be dismissed. And I'm going to fight this case because clearly my rights have been violated during the course of this search and seizure. And basically that was just simply ignored. Mm-hmm. And again, that innate part of me that just cannot accept, and I'm a Taurus, by the way, so I'm stubborn. And so I decided, well, I'm going to fight this case, win, lose, or draw, whatever the outcome is, and then I will take it up on appeal. Well, unfortunately, in my case, because I didn't feel like I was getting effective representation of counsel, I chose to take the stand, and that would waive all of the errors in those constitutional and civil rights violations, which would in turn make me lose my appeal. Right. So one of the things that happened during the trial, which I often cite when I talk and lecture, and I'll share with you, was the prosecutor said during the punishment phase, "Do you see how articulate he is? This is what makes him dangerous. And I want you to consider giving him 45 years, which is a year for every crack rock of cocaine, which was about 8 grams, $800 worth. And the jury would sentence me to 22 and a half years." And so what you can reflect on when we unpack a statement like that is, he was basically saying, had I been ignorant in Black, then I would have been harmless. So statements like that, he was both demonizing, weaponizing, and criminalizing my intelligence. And, you know, historically, there's evidence of this after Reconstruction, with the resentment for the social, political, economic gains of African Americans. And then thereafter, Black codes and Jim Crow laws and things like that were created due to this kind of racial animus. But of course, no one in that jury or that courtroom objected. No one gasped. He just said it very confidently, casually, and no one was culturally competent, as we say now, to be able to respond or even recognize that kind of use of language. But I did, even as a 19-year-old kid, and it's something that has stuck with me for the past almost 30 years. And so, you know, this, in my case, wasn't about justice. It wasn't about public safety. It wasn't about a reparation of harm that I caused towards a community. This was simply about the issue of malice, retribution, you know, which is the kind of justice system that we have, to where he decided in that moment, I'm going to make an example out of you. And this is going to strike fear in the hearts of men and women who would ever decide to challenge the system or the status quo. And this is what I call a judicial lynching, because just like lynching, it is done to make an example out of you, to strike fear in the hearts of men from standing up to the system or the status quo.
Very, very. Yeah, very, very. That kind of takes it out of the realm of your individual story to something much larger. The issue that's much larger than the system presents to us.
Yes, from the surface, definitely, because most people wouldn't even be able to make that kind of connection.
So, following that trial, as you said, you were convicted, sent to prison. Having read this section of the book, it was something of a journey to get you to wherever you were going to go eventually, which turned out to be a prison which was privately owned. And that was an experience in and of itself. Where I want to focus us, though, is on the decisions that you made in terms of how you were going to spend that time, really not knowing how long it was going to be. By the way, with a spoiler alert, it was not 22 and a half years. You were released after 5.5 years, right. And came out as a 24-year-old and began to remake your life. But that was after you had made some critical decisions about how you were going to spend that time in prison to make yourself into a better human being. And I'm going to put on this level: physically, intellectually, and spiritually.
Yes.
And I'd like you to talk to those 3 areas about how the time period you spent in prison affected your life.
Yeah, certainly. And when you mention the spiritual, physical, intellectual, I mean, all of that is basically a holistic approach. And I probably didn't even know that that was the approach that I was taking for my life then. And here's why: because, you know, I realized I'm going to be here for a while. And so I want to take advantage of all the opportunities that prison had to offer me. Well, unfortunately, because I was a high school graduate, one of the correctional officers told me, well, the state has already paid for your education once. We're not going to do it again. So prison, in a sense, didn't really have anything to offer me intellectually unless I would have transferred from the minimum medium security unit that I was on and went to a maximum security unit and got accepted to attend college. And unfortunately, I wasn't there long enough before I was sent to a private prison in Lockhart, which is the Lockhart Correctional Center about 30 miles away from here. And it was there where I spent most of my time in all. I mean, I spent the year in the county jail, 6 months in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice at the Dolph Briscoe unit, and then settled in at that private facility in Lockhart. And it was there that I began to learn how to play chess. And I sat with an older gentleman who taught me how to play chess. And he said, this is a gentleman's game and this is a strategic game. And so I started making the parallel that for every move that you make in life, it has consequences that can be beneficial or detrimental. And fortunately, they did have a level of programming there that I could do. So I took a desktop publishing course while I was there. I'd already knew how to type and was computer literate. So I did that. And there was a presentation that I had to reproduce called Public Speaking, Listening and Speaking. And so I began to study that religiously because I'd always admired great speakers and orators. And so I took that back to my cell and read it over and over again. And then I reproduced the document as one of my assignments. And by this time, you know, I had friends who were Muslims who I knew from society and knew what kind of people they were before. But I was a young kid. I wasn't trying to accept Islam or become Muslim or even, you know, heighten my faith in Christianity. I grew up in the Methodist faith. But I witnessed the transformation of these men while they were incarcerated, and they were very bright and very informed. And that was something that appealed to me and resonated with me most. And so I started attending their Friday Jummah services. And then there was a time when Ramadan came around and I hadn't accepted the faith, but I wanted to participate because they told me about the process of fasting and the benefits of fasting. And I said, well, I can do that. You know, let me do that. And so I participated with them. And that is how I began to develop myself spiritually, was through participation with them. But I was still rejecting the practice and the discipline that is required. And so that probably took another year later before I actually started praying and going through the principles or the tenets, the pillars of Islam. And then once I just said, okay, I give up doing things my way, I'm gonna try this. And that level of discipline that is expected of you and required was transformational for me, because ultimately, as I spent time there and started changing my behavior and practices, other men begin to look up to me. So it's kind of like here I am, this young kid, 22, 23 years old, and there are guys who are much older than me looking to me for leadership and guidance. And they had appointed me to be their coordinator because in prison, the Islamic faith is the only one that can practice independently. It doesn't require a chaplain or a minister or so on. So it's based on the predicate of the most knowledgeable among you is the one who will be out front, who will be the imam. And so in taking it seriously, knowing that I was going to be responsible for other men's spiritual education, you know, I realized, well, I have to do something about that. So I would study day and night just to be prepared that Friday to give the sermon or the khutbah. Because, you know, I believe that you can't give what you don't have and you can't teach what you don't know. And so the hardest lecture, sermon, or talk to give is when you don't know what you're talking about. So that was my journey. And of course, when you talk about the physical part, I was a skinny kid, about 145 pounds, going into prison. And I wanted to do something about that too. And so, I balanced that incarceration with exercise, lifting weights. So I was developing everything along the way. And I would often advise men, if you're not going to be a boxer, a wrestler, or a fighter, when you transition to society, then lifting all these weights serves no purpose. You should be lifting some books and educating and building your mind at the same time. So that's my response to your question.
And you took advantage of that time also because, as you said, you were a a high school graduate, and therefore were able to perform a job that really had some constructive elements to it, as opposed to being in the fields and sweating and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I actually was a librarian when I first got to prison. I did work in the fields, and then I became a librarian for a little while until I was transferred to Lockhart. And Lockhart was a work program facility at the time. So I ended up manufacturing circuit boards for the semiconductor industry here in Austin, and was what we call an MI, manufacturing inspector, and a quality assurance inspector for the boards that we were shipping out through subcontracts.
But when you try to take that skill back into the world, you met something of a stone wall because of your record.
Yes, I met what is called corporate hypocrisy, because Dell and IBM and all of those other companies, AMD, were content to come into the facility and subcontract their work with us, because at the time, I think minimum wage was about $4.15, and that's what we were paid. And then basically half of that was taken to be quartered in the facility and through taxes. So I was probably making about $2.50 after it was all said and done. And so I used that experience even to this day, because, as we advocate for the rights to work, basically, and to own a living, and if we expect men and women like myself to be successful, then we have to afford them an opportunity.
Exactly. And we'll talk about your work, by the way, with the Reentry Roundtable as well, which hits that area. But I also want to make the point, before moving into that next phase, that you took that money that you were earning in that time period and socked it away, because you knew that coming out of prison, most people come out of prison with exactly nothing. And that puts you even further behind the eight ball, because you have to live on something until you can get your life reordered again. You came out, I can't remember how much money you had, but you'd done pretty well, right?
Yeah, I was strategic and visionary in what I was going to do with that money. And I think ultimately I would end up with maybe $250 a month. And so I said to myself, well, for every 5 months that I'm here, that's going to be $1,000. And the goal was, well, if I can leave prison with $5,000, $10,000, I know that that money can be better spent in my transition to, rent an apartment, buy new clothes, a car, and those kinds of basic hierarchical needs. One of the greatest challenges and barriers for people reentering, because, they had changed the parole laws, what we call gate money. When a person paroles, they used to get $200. And in '94, the legislature reduced that to where it was only $100. So a person is basically getting out of prison with $50 in a bus ticket and told to go on with their lives and expected to be successful. Meanwhile, the state of Texas has over 200 laws and 1,900 separate licensing and statutory restrictions that bar or prohibit persons with felonies from employment. And then that other $50, by the way, you don't get until you successfully report and meet your parole office. So you're basically expected to transform your life with $100. You may not have housing, you may not have employment. And so, it's a very daunting task to overcome those odds.
Absolutely. But just, I want to throw in here some of another sad event that occurred while you were in prison, which is your father's death. He was murdered.
Yes.
And when you came out, your major support, not only financially, but I mean like emotionally, was your mom.
Yes.
That she was very much there for you. And I want to make people aware of the fact that you're very much there for her now.
Yes.
And that is also an important indicator of your character.
Yes. I often tell people that, there were really no reentry programs because at the time, no one was even talking about criminal justice reform in 1998. We were still in the 90s era of, 3 strikes, very harsh on crime and those kinds of things. And so it was my mother who had opened up her home for me to return to make parole, because growing up, I lived with my father. My father had custody of my brother and I. And it was actually a week after arriving on the Gulf Briscoe unit that I would get a call to come to the captain's office. And on the other end of the phone was my uncle telling me that my father had been murdered that Saturday, or he was killed. And ultimately, I thought it was a car accident or something like that. I didn't think it was a homicide or anything tragic. And so prison is something that tests you mentally, emotionally, psychologically. And his case was an unsolved cold case for about 14 years after that. And, I had somewhat made peace with it while I was there because I didn't have any other choice but to. And it took a while for me to ever even go visit my father's plot in the cemetery, because I remember the last conversation that we had and talking to him before I left the county jail on my way. And so we never had any conversations, after that. And I often reflect about how, my father never got the opportunity to see me make parole. He never got the opportunity to see me become a man. He never got the opportunity to see me become successful, who I am today. And so a lot of that is the impetus and the motivation for who I am as a man, because I can often reflect upon the wisdom and the things that he shared with me while he was here, even though I was a young kid and rejecting, they still stuck. And I can recall those lessons and valuable lessons. And so as we are today, as you mentioned, now I'm a caregiver taking care of my mother who took care of me.
Beautiful. So I wanted to get to a part of your story that I found interesting and something instructive for the rest of us who have the opportunity to be helpful to somebody along the way. And that is that the job you currently have, and have had for what, 20 years now?
22 years now.
At the Office of Risk Management for the state of Texas.
Yes.
That came to you because somebody was willing to take a chance and look past the record.
Yes. Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, what I will share with that is I began a temp job with the State Office of Risk Management. I had gone through a staffing company called Peak Performers that finds placement for people with disabilities. And by me having a drug conviction, even though I wasn't a user, that qualified me for that kind of disability. And so I spent 13 months on that temp assignment, ironically, with crime victims of compensation. And that was an internal struggle or internalized social oppression because I couldn't share or divulge with these people my criminal background. And so I walked this dual life in secret due to the shame and stigma. But I realized while I was there, and what I learned is that when you build a relationship with people, and establish a rapport and trust and social capital, then those same people will advocate for you. And so based on my performance in that role, I spent my time there learning all of those systems and actions with the agency and taught myself 10 key about touch in my downtime. And the accounting manager would offer me a job. And she said, is there anything that I should know? And ultimately I had to tell her, well, 7 years ago, I was convicted of possession of controlled substance with the intent to deliver. And she said, is that it? And much to my relief, the whole weight had been lifted. Unfortunately, though, John Cornyn was recently elected as the new Attorney General. And so they offered me this job without having to interview for it. But then I didn't ever hear anything. And the next thing I know, someone else has received that position. So I'm really puzzled and confused. And I was quite upset by it, but I didn't emotionally react. I went back home, talked to my mother and consulted with her and told her what I was going to do. And I said, I'm going to call a meeting with the supervisor and that manager and give them a piece of my mind and, find out what's going on with this. And so I did that. And they said, well, basically we were told not to say anything, but ultimately, because we have a new attorney general, it wouldn't look well that we have someone who is a convicted felon working for crime victims' compensation. And I could accept that. But what this woman would do was use and spend her privilege to advocate for me. And so she picked up the phone and she called the CFO for the State Office of Risk Management. She said, I have a candidate here and he's excellent and you need to pull his application. And so he did. And then probably about a week or so later, I would be called down after work for an interview and I met the immediate supervisor. That interview went well. Then she took me into the CFO's office probably 10 or 15 minutes later. And that interview was going quite well. And then in walks the assistant director of the agency. And she was quite harsh and lit into me immediately. And she said to me, well, why should I trust you? And my response was, because I'm not a thief, I'm not a robber, I'm not a white collar criminal or embezzler. I sold drugs. Now, I've been honest with you, you be honest with me. If I'm not gonna get this job because of my background, then I'm gonna face discrimination for the rest of my life because I've already been shot down for a job. And she immediately got on the defensive and said, oh, no, we don't discriminate. But my lesson here is that, sometimes you have to shame people into doing the right thing and call them to be their better selves. And so the next question she would ask me was, well, why should I hire you? And I said, because I believe that I am capable, and regardless of whether you have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, or a PhD, no one can walk on a job and perform without being trained. And so therefore we're equal. And then I could see the confidence just kind of leave her body. And she said, well, you mean to tell me you've done time? I said, yes. And had I not had that experience, then I wouldn't be a better person. And she would later say, well, it's not up to me, the executive director, he's going to want to meet you. And so it was probably another week or so later, I would be called into the ED's office and here are all these men in suits, the general counsel, the CFO, make it intimidating for a young man like myself. And he would ask me, he said, well, why is it that you want to work for the State Office of Risk Management? And I said, because, I need some stability in my life. I can't work temp jobs for the rest of my life. And he asked me a series of questions about drug testing and parole. So I shared that with him. And then he said, you know what? I truly can appreciate and respect your forthrightness and your candor. And I don't believe that a person should be held accountable for the rest of their lives. So welcome aboard. And the rest is history. And so I've worked for the State Office of Risk Management and moved up through the ranks from an accounting technician to now I'm a senior accountant, or have been a senior accountant for about 8 years since. And so now I'm in my 22nd year, and I hope to retire in the next 3 to 5 years.
So what does the State Office of Risk Management do? I'm just curious. I mean,
the State Office of Risk Management, we pay the workers' comp insurance claims for state employees, interstate employees. And on the risk management side, we do what's called the program reviews and the on-site consultations for agencies to mitigate risks for their safety. We also train in basically active shooter, slip, trips, and falls, pandemics, the response, and all those kinds of things is what the agency does. And the property insurance for the government, of course, you can't put a price tag on the Capitol or the governor's mansion, but we help negotiate those policies and things like that.
Outstanding. It sounds, on top of everything else, it sounds like interesting work.
Yes.
That's great. Okay, so let me take you one other direction, and that is, so here you are. You had this, as you put it, you were looking for stability, nothing more stable than work over the state of Texas, and you've got, your home life's okay, and most people, I could venture, might just settle for that, and you didn't. You decided you were going to take that stability and that experience and begin to do the hard work of advocacy as well on behalf of the issues that you had encountered in your life and beyond. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about why you made that decision to become active in the public square in that way.
Yeah, because it was something that I'd often thought about, but didn't necessarily know where to begin or what organization to become a part of or how, didn't know the why or the how. And then I was listening to Michelle Alexander on the radio, and this was around 2010. She had just written her book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and I would hear her talk about reentry and the barriers and this caste system of people with convicted felonies. And, all of these things, of course, were resonating with me because I already knew them from my own lived experience and what those challenges were. But this was the first time I'm hearing someone talk about this in the mainstream and elevate this. And so she came to Wesley United Methodist Church, which happened to be my family's church. And she was brought there by the United Methodist Church and the NAACP, and she gave a lecture. And she was talking about, you, meaning those of you in the audience, are going to help end this movement, this mass incarceration. You're going to lead this movement. And, that just set with me and inspired me, and still didn't do anything with it. But it was there. And then I was listening to community radio station 88.7 KZI, the voice of Austin. And I hear this Chicano gentleman on there talking about how he had spent 27 years incarcerated, and he was now working for the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition and writing bills and doing legislative advocacy, and that they were forming this group under the Austin Travis County Rancher Roundtable, which would then be called the Ex-Offenders Council. And so I said to myself, well, I got to go find this guy. I've got to look him up. I've got to go to one of their meetings. And so I did. And so it was a culmination of those events that led me to fighting for criminal justice reform, because I knew that I had something that I could lend, except it had been stifled, basically, which was my voice, because my profession doesn't lend itself for me to be able to do these kind of things, to operate in my passion, purpose, and strengths, so to speak. And it was there that I began to amplify my voice, and knowing that, well, there's someone else coming behind me and I could possibly share with them my experiences and impart some advice or something, pour into them that, hey, it's possible, because they said it couldn't be done, that I couldn't do 17 years on parole. And I was still on parole at the time, and, had transitioned and had this successful life. So I wanted to be an example to others to show the possibilities.
That's, that takes it up, a notch. And that's really, that to me is extraordinary. So let me ask you a question. Based upon your experiences, what could be done, particularly within the prison system, to try to increase the chances that there'll be more young men and now young women coming out of prison really ready to re-enter society and, like yourself, be, if not achieve leadership positions, at least be constructive members of society? What should we be looking at in order to accomplish that?
Something that we should be looking at, it, of course, education, number one, making that more accessible, but also peer support from someone like me, someone with an accreditation of lived experiences versus academic experience, because we don't necessarily get to go in as freely unless it's through faith-based chaplaincy. Programs are generally how most volunteers go in, instead of, just someone out here who's a community advocate or leader being able to go in and teach or train and these kinds of things. I think there should be access for men and women like me who have successfully re-entered society to be able to go in, whether it's, bi-monthly or every month, every quarter or something, and go in and share our stories of success. The next thing that I believe needs to happen is the education on the outside with family, because often family isn't prepared for their loved one to return. They don't know where to begin to help or with these resources. And they're expected to be case manager, social worker, Uber, Lyft, cab driver, what have you. And they're just not necessarily equipped to do that, because the state has given up on what they used to have a program called Project Rio that did some of that case management and job placement, but that was defunded in 2011. So now it's faith-based organizations, community-led organizations who are just doing this out of their own capacity, and volunteer work. Goodwill Central Texas is one of them that's taken up the slack for that education component, and the case management side for men and women who may not have obtained their GED while they were incarcerated. They can pursue that out here and then transition into ACC. So those are the main points that I think where attention could be addressed on the inside and the outside.
And I know that you've also, as you noted at the outset, on the oversight board for the Public Defender's Office. And I know that you have, based on your own experience, understand the difficulties, both the challenges, but also the opportunities of having a public defender's office to truly represent those who are in need of representation, and formulating that world so that it really is effective for their clients.
Absolutely, because indigent defense is one of the most important things, but also I can't say really underfunded, but I can in a sense, because it doesn't exist everywhere. For example, here in Austin, Travis County was the largest county in the state that didn't have a public defender's office. And even as this is being established and rolling out, it isn't comparable to the district attorney's office, which is often the case in most cities and states. The district attorney's office is highly well funded as a county agency versus the public defender's office. And, you know, we can basically mitigate a lot of the outcomes on the front end when a person has representation from the onset versus not having any at all, because often men and women are hurled into that courtroom like cattle. And, you know, it's just a processing plant for you to go in and here's the deal. You can take it or leave it, or we're going to do this. We're going to give you life if you don't do this. So this is the coercion that happens within our system, to where 95% of people plead out cases, whether they're, you know, innocent or guilty.
And I want to ask you one last thing about your personal philosophy, in that were you a co-founder or founder of Grassroots?
No, actually, Grassroots was founded by a Jewish gentleman named Cy Khan 40 years ago in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he was a member of SNCC and marched with Dr. King in the civil rights movement. And so he founded the organization to help communities build power in teaching them how to organize. So Grassroots relocated to Austin about 17 years ago. And it used to be on Cesar Chavez, and it was mainly focused around closing private prisons, and then expanded to immigration. So now it leads on those two fronts nationally, with the local focus on immigration and criminal justice reform.
But your philosophy as an advocate is to organize the community so that it can to empower people so they can advocate for their own interests.
Yes, ultimately to amplify the voices of those directly impacted, where someone like me can pour into them and can train them in how to frame and tell their stories in what we call the counter narrative. Because we hear enough of the dominant narrative on the news, but we don't hear enough of the counter narratives, which are stories like mine, where people can be exceptional, provided the opportunity. And you have to begin to amplify those voices and reflect that, which is ultimately what you're doing here tonight, is amplifying my voice as a counter narrative to what we often hear about the statistics of recidivism. And, you know, people are always no good. There's no redemptive quality in these people. You know, this is what we hear all the time. And, you know, it often speaks to even the retributive, harsh realities of people who have never been victim or survivors of crime tend to be some of the harshest people versus those who've actually lived that experience of being a survivor of violent crimes.
That is really interesting. That people who have been the victims are often less harsh than those people who are just theorizing about it.
Yes.
That is a very interesting observation. Very, very interesting. Okay, I'm going to end up on a lighthearted note. You still want a Jaguar?
I still have it. Well, one of them. And for those of you who hadn't read the book, and I talk about in the book, where I was walking in the rec yard with a close friend of mine, and he was saying, "What are you going to do when you get out of prison?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to make $20,000, $30,000 and I'm going to buy me a Jaguar." And he said, "What?" He said, "Man, how in the hell are you going to do that? And you've never had a job before." And I said, "Watch, you'll see." And so, you know, I didn't get it immediately, but it took some time and saving, of course. And so I ended up getting that Jaguar at, I think I was maybe 25, 26 years old.
Oh, that's pretty fast.
Yeah, and so it was probably a year or two after parole, and it's always been a car. I told him, I said, "Well, I've had other cars. I've never had one of those, so that's what I want." And then in 2001, I bought a newer one, and I ended up selling the first one. So I still have that car to this day. And it's a 95 Jaguar Avant Plus. And so it's 25 years old now. course, my book is called 25 Years Later, but yeah, my
Wow.
car is it's 25 years old and it's oxidized, but I love it to death.
I can only imagine. That's great. Boy, the ambition to make $25,000-$30,000 a year. Wow.
Yeah, and it started out actually much less than that. It started out with $6.25.
Wow.
But through dedication, discipline, and consistency, I believe that you can do anything you want to do.
That is a wonderful way to end our discussion. You are the living example of teshuvah, of taking life in a direction, a new direction, a better direction. And your story is a hopeful one and brings hope to us all. So,
thank you.
And inspiration as well. Let me add that rapidly.
Thank you. Darwin,
thank you so much. I really appreciate this time to be able to share your story with others and to, as I said a moment ago, draw inspiration, particularly at this holy time of year. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.